A cold breeze lifted the gray fur around the edge of the man's hat, brushing it across the corner of his eye. Instinctively, he sent a quick, sidelong glance in the direction of the darkening skies. Then, he turned sharply and faced them. The mammoth storm seemed closer already. Its foremost edge hung ominously above him like a behemoth, settling in to devour its prey. The beast dropped feathery white veils earthward from its belly, warning of the fury to come. Joe could feel the chill of its breath as the storm advanced, driving away the token warmth the sun had offered. The roiling mass stretched its thick arms toward him, taking hold of everything in its path. The very thought of those arms catching him in their grasp sent chills dancing across his shoulders and down his spine. Joe shuddered and turned back to the road. He calculated the odds of reaching home before the storm caught him in its terrible embrace. They were by no means in his favor. His sledge was heavy with enough supplies to last the remainder of the winter. As it was, the horses often slipped in the snow and ice that lingered from the last storm. Joe knew the road well, but no one knew this part of the prairie well enough to navigate it in a whiteout. No one. The man let out a low, uncharacteristic growl of frustration, looking over his shoulder once more. It was just too far to go back. He looked forward, squinting thoughtfully as he studied the road. It was still another 4 miles home. With the way things were going, it might take him as many hours to get there. He sighed as he tugged the fur-lined sleeves of his heavy coat over the cuffs of his gloves. It was getting colder. There was no question about that. He again flicked the reins, but the horses' only response was to shake their heads wildly as if to say, "We're giving you all we can." Joe searched the road beyond them, wondering for a moment if he was closer to any of his neighbors than to home. He didn't have to think hard. He knew he'd gone beyond that point. Nothing was closer than home. It made no sense to try to scheme his way out of this one. He'd gotten himself in much further than he'd ever imagined possible as he sat in the warmth of John's sitting room earlier that afternoon. He took a deep breath and let it out noisily, then leaned back and stared past the horses. His course was set. Nothing could be done about it. He'd made a choice, and now he'd have to live with the consequences. "I should have listened," he mumbled into the faded woolen scarf protruding around his neck and throat from beneath the coat. "John's always been good at calling storms. He's almost never wrong." The man slapped his gloved hand against his knee, but the pile of furs and blankets across his lap muffled any sound the action might have made. The flat thud only served to bring a scowl of disappointment to Joe's face. He glanced again to the south, but this time his eyes didn't go to the sky. Guilt swept over him as he realized he was passing the lane of his former employer, Jedediah Wilkes. "Should have listened then, too," he muttered. The overgrown lane led to nothing. Wilkes had turned out to be a scoundrel. He'd sent his men to town, driven off all the cattle, absconded with a good many tools and cash that he'd found among the men's belongings, set every structure on fire, and made for parts unknown. No one knew why he'd done it. His debts hadn't been so great that he couldn't have easily repaid them upon the sale of his herd. John had said it was plain and simple spite, and Joe was inclined to believe him. It little mattered now. Wilkes was gone, never to be heard from again, and good riddance at that. As he thought of the days that had followed the event, his mind wandered further down the road, past his family's modest ranch, to another little farm, and the young woman who lived there. Jessica Bennett. The thought of her made him warm inside, and yet somehow in the same moment it rebuked him. If only he'd listened to John and stayed in Twin Pines, this wouldn't be happening. He'd be seated comfortably next to John's fire, with a meal in his belly and a warm bed waiting. But no, he hadn't listened. And now he was just where the other man had predicted he'd be. And for that, there was no excuse. Jess would be horrified if she knew what he'd done.